So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome our first webinar of 2021, our first WIHTL webinar. And I'm delighted to see some very familiar names on the webinar today and to see some new names as well, which is fantastic. So for those of you who don't know me or don't know WHTL, my name is Joanna and I'm a director at WHTL. And we as an organisation, we exist to increase representation at the most senior levels and throughout our industry of women and people from ethnic minority backgrounds, with a very ambitious aim that we want to positively impact 5 million people by 2025 globally across our industry. So we hold various seminars, webinars, we run programs, and we work with many of the companies that you have come from today to collaborate, come together and really progress inclusion and diversity, particularly around gender and ethnic minority talent in our industry. So welcome if this is your first time joining us. I'm delighted that we're joined by Sarah Taylor, and Sarah is a leadership coach, a trainer and facilitator with a very varied background that I will let her share with you, but has a particular passion and interest, and at the heart of her practice is neuroscience and how we understand our brains to be more productive and effective within our roles. And I think particularly this session is about how do we do that for ourselves and for our teams as well. So how do we make ourselves more productive so that we can help our teams, particularly in a virtual world, particularly when, you know, a vast majority of us are working from home. And in lockdown number 3, I think it's particularly pertinent. So welcome, Sarah. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And just a few housekeeping pieces for those of you. We all know Zoom and Teams and everything, but how we work within our webinars is if you look at the bottom of your screen, you have your chat function, and we would ask you to put any thoughts or questions or reflections into the chat rather than the Q&A, because it means we can just focus on one part. And we shall also be launching some polls as part of this session. It will be very interactive, so please do take part, use the chat. We will try and answer as many of the questions as we can. We may bring some of you and open your mics because we've got quite a big group. And I will ask you if you want to come on screen or not. The advantage of Zoom meetings is that you don't necessarily want to come on screen, but we'll definitely, if it's appropriate, we can open mic as well, depending on the questions. And when you do the chat, I'd just like to highlight, please try and do it to everybody, all panelists and attendees, and with the polls as we do them, because we're going to kick off with a poll. It's anonymous, so please don't worry for answering the questions. No one will know. It's completely anonymous, your responses. So would you like me to start with the poll?
Yeah, do you want to kick it off and then I'll...
Yeah. And we'll do that. Yeah. Fabulous. So we've got our first poll. We've got a few throughout the session, but I will launch our first poll and it'd be great to get your thoughts. So the first question is the question that should all come up on your screen. And the first question is, how would you rate how resilient and motivated you are feeling currently? And the second being, how would you rate how resilient and motivated the people around you are feeling currently? And we'll just wait a couple of minutes for people to fill that in. And then we will share the results on the screen. So people are voting fast today. So so people, this is one. So we're probably a few more of you, and I'll wait till we hit the vast majority, and then we will vote. I will share that with you. Okay, I think we're in a good place. Let me just end that poll and share the results. So let me know that everyone can see that. So for the first poll, I think, which is great, which is fabulous, that the vast majority of people, nearly half have said they feel good, which is great. And then a mixture from really high through to lower than average so it's a kind of 50-50 split, I think, with one one half across the spectrum. And then I think the people around you, which interestingly is the vast majority of us have said that around is average. So people are feeling in an average sense. So thank you for doing that. And I will pass over to Sarah, who will kick off our session.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Joanna. It's great to be here. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Just to kick off by introducing myself, my name's, as Joanna said, I'm Sarah Taylor. I'm a leadership coach, trainer and facilitator. And my focus in my business, particularly in the last 9 months, has been on supporting leaders and teams to both maintain and boost well-being and performance in the work from home environment. So as well as this talk about the brain, I also do another workshop all about how to listen better, and also another one about how to kind of develop coaching skills as a leader, so that can help you to have powerful coaching conversations with your teams. Quick background on me, as Joanna mentioned, I've got a varied background. My background is actually in journalism. So I spent 15 years producing and directing documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4 and Discovery. And so I've really spent my career telling stories, and particularly stories about science. And I'm convinced that there's never been a more urgent need than right now, in the pandemic that we're all living through, and the third lockdown that we're all living through, to really tell the story of the brain. I believe passionately that when we understand what drives us, what drives our brains, what motivates them, we're much better able to adapt, not just for ourselves, but for the people around us, both at work and at home. And that poll has suggested that there is some, a considerable amount of concern for the people around you in terms of making sure that they're good, and recognizing that people's well-being and resilience at the moment is at an average level. So what I want to really do with this, for the next sort of 50 minutes to an hour, is give your brain a voice. So I set myself a challenge with this. If your brain could talk, what would be the 3 things that it would tell you? What would be the 3 most important things that it would share with you and advise you right now? So here we go. I'm just going to launch my presentation. Just give me a second. Okay. So bizarrely enough, the very first thing I think your brain would tell you is, I'm pretty old-fashioned. But once you know that, there's lots of stuff that you can do to support me. So let me talk you through it. It can really surprise people to hear this, that our brains are pretty old-fashioned. But the truth is, your brain's not just a little bit old-fashioned. We're not just harking back to the 1960s here. Our brains are actually hundreds of thousands of years old in evolutionary terms. And just to put that into context, if you were to shrink the existence of our species into a single day, and the first human evolved at sort of midnight, it would take a full 22.5 hours until 10:30 p.m. in the evening for the first farming to exist and be invented. And it wouldn't be until 30 seconds before midnight until the very first computer arrived on the scene. And that tells us that for the vast majority of our history, the human experience has been profoundly different to the one that we're familiar with now. We lived on the African savannah in groups of hunter-gatherers, and the overriding preoccupation of our brain at that time was exactly the same as for every other animal. It was to keep us safe and to keep us alive. And just like every other animal, we've evolved a reflex inside our brains to help us do exactly that. It's called the fight or flight reaction. It's an automatic physiological reaction triggered by the brain to an event that is perceived as stressful, threatening, or frightening. So in the olden days, that threat might look something a bit like this, a saber-toothed tiger out on the prowl. Nowadays, we're lucky, we don't have quite so many threats to our survival. But the fight-flight reaction remains deeply ingrained in our brains and our biology, and it's actually triggered much more often than you might think. So I want to tell you a little bit about the fight-flight reaction to see if you recognize some of the effects of it in your body. So it does exactly what it says in the tin. The fight-flight reaction prepares our body to either flee from danger or prepares us to fight against it. So what happens in terms of our physical body is our hearts start beating faster, our muscles tense, we can feel a knot in the pit of our stomachs, we get sweaty palms, we breathe more quickly, and the stress hormone cortisol is released into our bloodstreams. It also has a really big effect on mood. It can make us feel more anxious, it can make us much quicker to anger, and much more easily frustrated. And if all these things weren't problematic enough, it actually also has an impact on our brain's performance, because the fight flight reaction either locks down at the most extreme level, it locks down, and at a more gentler level, it actually handicaps the rational brain. And this is why I just step out for a minute to explain this to you, that our brains are hugely complicated organs, but it's useful in a work context to think about two areas of the brain, the rational areas of the brain, which are the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind your forehead here. This is the kind of newest, most uniquely human area of the brain. And then there's the emotional brain, the limbic system, that sits right at the heart of our brains, at the core. And that's responsible for sort of quick acting, fast, impulsive behavior. Whereas the rational brain is what we use on a daily basis for our work, to help us make logical decisions, to plan for the future, use creative thinking. So what happens with the fight flight reaction when the rational brain gets locked down? It can seem a little bit crazy that that might happen, but from a survival perspective, that actually makes a lot of sense. If you think back to your example of a saber-toothed tiger, if we engaged our rational brains at this point and started weighing up the various merits of, should I run up this tree? Should I run into this cave? Or should I run up that mountain? You probably wouldn't then be alive to tell the tale. So actually what we need in this instance to keep us alive is for the emotional brain, the fast acting, quick acting part of our brain, to take over. But we're lucky, we don't have any saber-toothed tigers around today, but I wanted to tell you a bit about what are the things that sort of generate this fight flight reflex in us today. And neuroscientists have done an awful lot of research in this area. I feel like the last 40 to 50 years are a real age of enlightenment when it comes to understanding our brains. And they've looked at the conditions that elicit the brain's flight reaction. And it makes for pretty sobering reading, especially in the context that we're living through now. Our brain interprets certain conditions as threatening, and they are the following: a lack of autonomy, which is a sense of control over our lives; a lack of certainty, a sense of what the future holds; and a lack of relatedness, a sense of safety and connection with others. And it's really important to understand these things can be triggered on an individual basis. So, for example, if we're subjected to some micromanaging by a boss or a peer, our autonomy might be threatened. Or if we're not invited to a meeting that we think we should have been invited to, our relatedness might be threatened. But this reaction can also be repeatedly triggered. And I think arguably COVID is really challenging our sense of all of these things, our sense of autonomy, our sense of certainty about the future, and our relatedness on a daily basis. So it's not really a massive step from here to recognize that the brain's really ancient fight or flight reflex is being activated on a daily basis across Britain's workforce. What can you do about it? I think the really important thing to say here is that knowledge really is power. When you recognize that this fight-flight reflex is hardwired in your brain and everybody else's brain around you that you work with, that you live with, then you know that it's a reflex that you can't override. It's there and it will happen. The only thing we can do is try to control what happens to us after it's happened, and what steps we can put in place to stop it affecting us as much as it can. So what I want to do now is give you some tips in terms of what you can do on a kind of one-off basis when you're triggered on a one-off basis, or when you can encourage other people to do when they're triggered on a one-off basis, but also what to do about this kind of constant triggering that may be happening as a result of the pandemic. So the first one is the sort of acute one-off triggering of this fight-flight reflex. And what I always recommend that people do is think about this mnemonic ECG. It's about, first of all, labeling the emotion. It's asking yourself, what am I feeling? You know, you might say to yourself, I'm feeling under pressure, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling overloaded. And it sounds such a simple thing to do, but just asking yourself that question gives yourself a little bit of more separation from your emotions, and it gives you that opportunity to gain a little bit of perspective. The next two things are really about very proactively re-engaging your rational brain. It's very easy when we're in a stressful situation to get sort of tunnel vision and to only see a limited number of choices. And it's about asking, engaging our rational brains and going, what are my choices here? And not accepting one or two answers, going, what else? What else? What else could I do? And the final one is G, is goal. It's just accessing the bigger picture, asking yourself, what is it I really want here, to help you make a decision between those choices. So that's an acute triggering of the fight flight reflex. What about a sort of an ongoing triggering of it? I spent a lot of time thinking about this in terms of how I could present it to you, because there's so much that I can say. But I think the single most important thing is not a mnemonic, it's just focusing on one word, which is me, and remembering that within the context of what you've just heard, and recognizing that this fight flight reflex can be triggered really quite easily at the moment in the context we're living in. It's about asking ourselves, what are we doing for ourselves? Arguably, I think this is the most important question we should be asking ourselves on a daily basis when we first wake up in the morning, as well as everything else we're trying to do. What is it that I'm doing for myself? But what I wanted to do, I think this is very individual what everybody chooses to do, but to give you three things that there is specific scientific evidence for that can be valuable in terms of combating this triggering of the fight flight reflex. The first one is meditation and mindfulness. There's some amazing research that's been conducted by academics at the University of Harvard, where they studied brains before and after a consistent 8-week practice of meditation. And they found that at the end of those 8 weeks, there were actual physical changes in the brain areas associated with stress. There are loads of amazing apps out there that we can access to have a go at meditation. I really recommend the Headspace app. And I think from a brain perspective, the key thing to say is, if it's something you're interested in doing, start small. The Headspace, the bare minimum you can do on there is 3 minutes a day. But if you could clear 3 minutes in your schedule to do it and try and start establishing the practice that way, then you can potentially grow and build it over time. There's a American podcaster who I really like called Tim Ferriss. He's an entrepreneur, and he runs one of the most successful business podcasts in the US. And he has interviewed, through his podcast, more than 500 sort of high performing business people. And he's obsessed with sort of daily routines, what people do, particularly in the mornings, what their morning routine is. And what he's found by asking these high performers this question is that more than 80% of the people he's interviewed have some kind of daily mindfulness and meditation practice. So it's definitely something that's worth considering. The other two things I just want to mention, exercise. We all know that exercise kind of boosts endorphin levels, but it also helps to reduce our responsiveness to that stress hormone cortisol. So it's a really valuable thing to do. And finally, although it might surprise, social support. Our brains are deeply social by nature. We're hardwired to enjoy talking, chatting, sharing, and being part of a group, which is why the experience of lockdown is particularly challenging. But I think if we recognize that this is something that can really help to kind of dampen that fight-flight reflex, often at the end of the day, we're so tired that the thought of picking up the phone is not the most appealing thing to do, but sometimes that can be the very best thing you can do to influence your mood. And then it's worth just stepping back from this as well and just saying, it's important to recognize these things in yourself as a manager and a leader, but also take a minute to think about the fact that this is happening in other people's brains too. And I think there's a lot of chat about, compassion at the moment, but compassion with understanding, I think, is really helpful. And knowing that this fight flight reflex might be being triggered in people around you. If you see somebody behaving a little bit, irrationally, or saying things that they wouldn't normally say, cut them. I just encourage you to cut people around you a bit more slack, even more slack than you would do ordinarily, and just recognize that these things might be taking their toll on their brain. So I just wanted to pull out for a minute from this, from the talk, and come back to the main room. And just, we have got another poll. Can I throw over to you, Joanna, to launch that poll? Oh, we can't hear you, Joanna.
It's classic Zoom. Sorry. So I'll launch the poll about our old-fashioned brains. Bear with me. There we go. So the question that should have appeared on your screen is, do you recognise the fight or flight reaction in yourself and or other people around you? So we'll just wait for people to vote. Again, very fast group today. I'm very impressed. We're nearly at 100%. Yeah, perfect. Great. Okay, I will end the poll there and launch the results, which is, I think,
wow. Right. That's really interesting to see. So no one doesn't recognise it. Most people do, and some maybe. So I'd love to just encourage a little bit of chat from people at this point. Normally I do this talk for groups of 15, 20, so I encourage people to talk directly to me. But obviously we're in a much bigger group today. And I just wondered if people could just tell me, what does hearing this make you think? And what might you want to change as a result of kind of hearing this about the brain's fight-flight reaction?
So we've got a question. So yeah. I will bring that up from Sian. Bear with me 2 seconds. Let's see. So Sian, I'll bring you into the mic. Sian, is that okay? And you can ask your question live.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not actually a question, it was more of a statement. So for me, it's interesting because I definitely recognise it in myself. But I don't, even though I genuinely do feel that I'm quite a highly empathetic person, I don't actually think about other people having those same that other people have got those same sort of stresses and the way that they show those stresses. So it's interesting to think of it like that, which is terrible to say, but it's just, it's interesting to understand that everyone's brain functions in a similar way.
Yeah. I think that's so true, and that's why it's always so important to draw that out, because the experience of having a brain is that we're inside our own heads all the time, we're inside our own thoughts, and it's very easy to not recognise that other people can experience those very same strong feelings that we experience too. So there's a note here from Emma. She says, the need to be kind to others is very, very high up on my own and my organisation's list, and also making time for self-care is a habit, but really challenging in the current times. Yeah, I definitely agree. It is really hard right now to find time for it. But I think the key that I always try and say is that when it comes down to your productivity at work, your brain will thank you for taking care of it.
And I think what's really interesting, Sarah, is, you and I have done some various sessions together already in different focuses. And the thing that really struck me, and I know we haven't touched on it too much today, is the fact that your brain, however old you are, because we have this concept that it kind of stops, you stop your learning and your ability to learn at a younger age, which we know isn't true, from the different sessions we run together, that your brain and the way that it connects can be different from the end of a conversation to the beginning of a conversation. And I think just in that piece of understanding how that is and how your conversations impact your teams, I think, in terms of this raw emotion and fight or flight mechanism, do you think that that's similar? Do you think that helps in terms of understanding that and framing conversations in that way?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also about recognizing that, inside our brains we think, but we do actually activate more of our brain networks when we speak our thoughts out loud. And it's that process that's really valuable to help us to clarify our thoughts. That's why coaching is so valuable. That's why counseling is so valuable. That's why mentoring, it's because you're getting an opportunity to say the things that are roaming around in your head and to kind of clarify them more. And that's why this other talk I do is all about listening, because when you listen well, it's like a superpower for the person who's being listened to. And it makes such a difference to helping to clarify thinking.
And we've had a lovely comment from Beth, who talks very much about finding it more difficult to be compassionate to yourself than to other people.
Yeah. I think that I'm just trying to read it too. Getting given access. Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think so many of us do it. You know, it cuts both ways. Either we can't see it in other people, or we can't recognize it in ourselves. But I think it's about, you know, the very fact that you recognize it in another person is the acknowledgement that that other person's human and you are too, and you're going to have those same experiences. There was a lovely note that a fellow coach of mine put on LinkedIn the other day, and it was just really simple. It said, who is listening to you at the moment? And I think there's a lot in that, right? We need to feel heard. We need our own voices to feel heard, and it's about recognizing that.
And there's a great question from Elder. So, and I would encourage you, if you put in the chat and you're comfortable to share it with the whole group, the panelists and attendees. But I think it's a fabulous question, which is, when you're dealing with a leader who is in that flight reaction, you know, what actions can you take to help them get back to their rational brain?
Yeah, that's a really big question. And I think I'd probably need even more time to reflect on it. But the first thing that I would probably say is just, it's like that labeling that I was talking about in terms of your own reaction to it. It's about recognizing that when the emotional brain is in charge, people don't think rationally. They think intuitively, very quickly. They see problems in a much more kind of narrow-minded way. And it's about effectively applying that same process to the person you're talking to and trying to very gently encourage them to re-engage with their rational brains by just asking, you know, first of all, let the emotion flow, let it come out, but then also asking them questions that really take them out of that kind of emotional space and much more into their rational brain, like, what could we do here? Or what is it you want to achieve here? Because those things directly activate the rational brain and help people to kind of step out of that mode. I hope that's helpful. Right, I'm conscious of time, so I think I'd better just jump back into the next thing that your brain would tell you. So the next thing your brain would tell you, if it could, is that I get blocked easily. But the corollary to this is you also have the key to unblocking me. And I'm going to tell you about why and how. So your brain is capable of incredible things. There are more possible connections inside your brain than there are atoms in the universe. We can walk on wires between skyscrapers. We can get men to the moon. We can defeat computers at chess. We can scale Everest. But paradoxically, the brain is also extraordinarily limited. The brain has a really tiny funnel when it comes to being able to apply conscious attention to things. And the best way I could think of describing this to you is to talk you through an attention experiment that was run by a British psychologist called Colin Cherry. And what he did is he asked participants to put headphones on, and he told them that they would hear different words in the right ear and the left ear. But what he asked them to do is listen into the right ear exclusively and repeat those words back to him after the experiment had finished. So they duly listened in, did exactly that, and were capable of repeating back the vast majority of those words. But when Cherry actually asked them for any information about what was going on in the left ear at that time, people tended to be pretty nonplussed. Most people could identify whether it was a male or a female voice. But beyond that, people couldn't identify what language people were speaking, let alone which words they were saying. And I like to kind of think of our brain's ability to apply conscious attention to things kind of in this sort of way. You know that character in Little Britain, Carol, who used to just constantly say, computer says no. We do all come up against it with our brains. The classic example, and I'm sure we've all experienced it, is of trying to hold a conversation, but you're trying to reply to a text message at the same time. So you're trying to talk to your friend or your husband or your wife or your child, but reply at the same time. We can just about manage a yes, no reply on the text, but any more information than that, our brains literally just go, no, I can't do it. Either you stop listening or you start writing gobbledygook on the text message. There's no sort of middle ground. And I think anyone who's a working parent in the room right now can probably relate to this point as well. Just the idea of trying to apply conscious attention to work and to educating our children at the same time. I mean, it's essentially an oxymoron. It's just really hard to do. The neuroscientist Dean Burnett has a wonderful analogy for this, for the ability of our brains to apply conscious attention. What he says is it's really worth thinking of your brain like a telescope that's fixed on the night sky. When you look through that viewfinder, you can see a small area of the sky in really beautiful, clear, crystal clear vision, but you can't see or apply your field of vision to anything outside the telescope's view. And I think this applies really well. You can extend this analogy to think about multitasking. I like to think of it as a bit like having the telescope, but sort of whipping it across the night sky. So you see the stars, but they're blurred. And actually there's been lots of experiments done, particularly in the US, which have shown that trying to do too much at the same time actually makes us less smart. And it can have an actual effect on our IQ of trying to do that. What can you do about it? I think the first thing is about recognizing that your brain is extraordinarily capable, but it's also limited when it comes to applying conscious attention to things. And it's really worthwhile. What I always say at this point is, it's often beneficial for your brain to pause in order to accelerate. When we multitask or when we hit a roadblock, for many of us, when we have a challenge with multitasking, many of us, our instinct is just to plow on, to promise ourselves a break once we solve the problem. But this is often really counterproductive. Not only is the brain's conscious attention limited, but it's also really easy for our brains to get locked into a certain way of thinking, a certain series of maps inside our brain. So often for our brains, the single best thing we can do is stop and reset. That's why often our best ideas will come to us when we're out walking or when we're boiling a kettle or when we're in the shower. I'd love to sort of abolish the myth that time at your desk is what matters. Actually, it's almost the reverse when it comes to your brain. When you hit a block, the single best thing you can do is get up, get away from it and come back, because you'll in all likelihood find that your work capacity is likely to be able to accelerate just by dint of having that, giving your brain that break. The other thing, I mean, it sounds obvious, but prioritizing. I'd love for people to reconnect with the true definition of the word priority. The Oxford Dictionary describes it as something that you think is more important than other things and should be dealt with first. We need to recognize that 5 strategic priorities is an oxymoron. We can have 5 things that are really, really important, but we can only have one thing that's the priority at any given time. Again, an analogy that I find really helpful is, back in the days when we were able to fly, the holding pattern of the planes at Heathrow, and they're going around in circles, but only one of them can land at one time. And it's about lining those things up, recognizing that we've got, for most of us, an awful lot to get through, but it's about selecting what are the things we want to work on now and telling your brain that there are other things, there are other things in the holding pattern, but we're not going to deal with them yet until we've solved this one. Right, so I just wanted to pull out again and send over to Joanna for a minute just to kind of launch that next poll. Which I think is, so the poll is, do you recognize this sort of computer says no feeling in your own brain at times? And I'll just give everyone a few minutes. Joanna, you're still on mute, just so you know.
Perfect, thanks, Sarah. It's because I wasn't focusing. I was probably multitasking. That's okay. So So I will say again, very fast groups. So when over 90%, I will end that poll and share the results for you.
Yeah. Yeah, we do recognise. And what I'd love to just ask people is, what does hearing that make? I mean, I'm always conscious when I'm sharing stuff about the brain that we kind of know this intuitively as well. But I think when you understand it from the context of the science about your brain, that there is actually a limited amount of things that your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that you use at work on a daily basis, can apply conscious attention to, it might make us start thinking a bit more about how we handle our workload. And I just love to encourage, well, if anyone's prepared to come on camera and have a chat and offer a comment like Sian did, or just to write a note in the chat box, that'd be really great.
So we've got, as I say, rather than the Q&A, if you've got a thought or reflection or a question for Sarah, if you want to pop that into the chat, that would be great. And I think as people are kind of putting, well, we have from Sian, I think people often believe that they can multitask, but it's clearly not the case. Do you think there's been an essence that we've been told that multitasking is the way forward? You know, there's a bit of a myth around that is productive to be able to multitask.
Yeah, I think there is a myth, but it's a myth based in fact. Essentially, when it comes to your brain, you can multitask. Okay, this is where you can multitask when it comes to an unconscious activity and a conscious activity. So for example, we can, if we're experienced drivers, we can very easily drive a car and hold a conversation with somebody at the same time, because the driving has become sort of locked into our conscious, our habits, our brains are capable of building habits. So we can do things like that. We can, you know, do the same thing. We can ride a bike and have a conversation with somebody at the same time. What we can't do is apply conscious attention to kind of resolving things that require rational thinking, deliberate thinking, because our brain's just not capable of doing it. So Megan's just written, and to juggle so much at one time, I think we have lost sight of the priority, as we feel so much is a priority. That's why we end up being counterproductive. I couldn't agree more. And then Beth says, I think people think they have to say yes to everything and can be scared to say no, especially to those in higher positions. Yes, I agree. There's an amazing book that I'd really recommend by an author called Greg McKeown. It's called Essentialism, and it's exactly about this. He just says we just all need to recognize that there's way too much on a daily basis and a monthly, annual basis for us all to do. And it's about recognizing that fact and then selecting what we want to prioritize. And then Barbara says, sometimes we're overwhelmed with looking, supporting others' agendas, and do not recognize the impact that is happening on you in terms of hitting the wall. You've got to walk away from it and breathe. Yeah, couldn't agree more. The comment, and then Rasha says, the comment about you can't have 5 strategic priorities at the same time resonates with me very strongly. I'm guilty of doing that with my team at times. And I love the flight analogy, made me think, oh, that's great. Yeah. And Sian, I have lots of people on my team who in current times will, particularly at the moment when on a call, their eyes are not focused as they would be if fully engaged with the meeting, and they're trying to email instead of focusing on what the meeting's about. Yeah. And I think that's the extra double whammy when it comes to working from home, right? Is that you think people can't see, but they can see. And I think the single hardest, like when it comes back to those things that I talked about, the brain needing, like certainty and relatedness, there's a challenge right there when you're on a Zoom call and you notice immediately that someone's really not engaging with your thinking. You don't have any certainty that they're absorbing what you're saying. In fact, you're pretty certain that they're not. And the relatedness is being challenged because you're like, well, why aren't they listening to what I'm saying? And I think we all come up against this, right? Our days are hard and we have to find our way through it, but it's just recognizing that is so important. Elder says, I've introduced Agile into our ways of working, but none is ready to prioritize as it is seen as lost opportunities. I don't think I quite get that one, Elder. I don't know if you want to add a little bit more. But maybe I'm just conscious of time, and I'm thinking I might just move, maybe we can come back to that afterwards. I'll just move on to the third and final insight and come back to sharing the screen, and then we can come out for a final chat. Okay. So the final thing that your brain would tell you if it could talk would be, please power me up. And I think we all know that there are certain things that help our brains and our bodies to perform well. Our brains are 75% water. If you don't drink, your brain's going to start struggling for performance. We need food. Exercise really helps, and so does sleep. But there's one additional thing that I think a lot of people don't know about the brain that it really benefits from, and that's novelty. Novelty is kind of like oxygen for the brain. It's the fuel that helps to wire and build our brains. This is the exact point that Joanna was talking about earlier in relation to neuroplasticity. And I want to explain why novelty is so important. I always like to use this analogy of a giraffe and a human baby. Other animals like the giraffe arrive into the world with a much more hardwired brain than we have. A giraffe can stand and walk within about 30 minutes of birth, whereas a human baby is pretty useless by comparison. We can't walk, we can't stand, we can't sit, we can't even hold our own heads up. It takes a year to 2 years for us to learn how to walk. And there's a really good reason for that. When the human brain starts its life, it looks something a bit like this. It's a blank slate. It's a giant bundle of potential, but we're not capable of using any of it. We have to learn how to use it. And this is the best visual analogy I can provide you with for what happens inside the brain as we grow. We create maps, we create road networks between the neurons in our brains that help us to do the things that we want to do. So our brains are actually hardwired to adapt to the experiences we expose them to. It's called neuroplasticity. And that process often, I think, until the field of neuroscience took off, I think people used to think that process of wiring our brains, of learning, stopped when we became adults, but it doesn't. It keeps going right the way through our lives. In fact, if I'm doing my job right, as Joanna referred to, your brain right now should be ever so slightly different to what it was like at the beginning of the call, just as a result of the new connections and the new learning that you've kind of exposed yourself to. And given how dependent our brains are on sort of wiring themselves through their experience, nature has evolved a really cunning way to make sure that we keep doing it. And what happens is our brains release a reward chemical called dopamine when we experience something new. Dopamine's a pleasure chemical. It makes us feel really good. It's that high that we feel when we, reach a new insight, have a new experience, try some new food. The brain actively releases dopamine to encourage us to keep exposing ourselves to new things and to keep wiring our brains. And that's why novelty is so important. It's a chemical kind of sort of feel-good factor. But I appreciate that I'm saying all this to you as we sit here in our third lockdown. We're not really supposed to be leaving our homes for more than exercise. It's tough. I'm preaching novelty, but how do you find it? The good news here is novelty does not need to be extreme. I'm not talking, we need to get out and skydiving, not that we even could. But arguably, it's understanding that seeking novelty it's simple things matter. And from the brain's perspective, it's the expectation of that novelty that's just as important as the experience of the novelty itself. So knowing that you've got something coming in your day that's new and different that you can look forward to is just as important as that experience. So what can you do? I think that the simplest hack is to take a pen and paper and just spend 2 minutes writing down your average daily routine, and then asking yourself, where is the novelty? Where am I getting my dopamine hit from? Other people that so let me start by saying it can be as simple as working from a different room, trying to work from a different room in your flat or your house. It can be as simple as taking a walk around the block between meetings. It can be, doing exercise. Other people who've come to this workshop have told me about things they do. There's one guy who loves running, but was finding it really hard to fit it into his work schedule. So he puts his head torch on by night and just goes running around Epping Forest. And the thing that surprised him was quite how many other people were doing exactly the same thing. There's someone else who talked about, taking a cold shower daily. That's definitely a novelty hit. And another person who said, he basically has his guitar by his desk, so that in between meetings, he can have just 5 minutes of just relaxing his brain and doing something else before he gets back to what he needs to do. The key thing to understand about novelty is that if you don't, and this is just a bit of a word of warning, that if you don't control your brain's need for novelty, then social media will definitely fill that hole for you. This is an entire industry that's been built off the back of giving your brain a sort of novelty hit. And you think about swiping down on your Instagram account, your LinkedIn account, your Twitter account, it's that expectation of getting access to new information that makes us feel good and makes us reach for our phone so often. So it's something just to be aware of. So before I wrap up, I'd love to come back and talk to everybody. I just wanted to share one final thought. I think the experience of working from home, a lot of us have recognised that it requires us to self-manage better than we ever have had to do before. There are fewer distractions, there are fewer people around, and we're alone with our own thoughts much more often. And this can be great when our brains are serving up really productive, exciting ideas, creative thoughts. But it's a bit more problematic when your brain starts serving up, sort of more pessimistic thoughts, or thoughts that are self-analysing your performance a bit too much. So I want to introduce you to this guy. He's called Mo Gaudat. He's the ex-chief business officer of Google X. And he recognised this pattern in his own thinking. And I think he came up with an ingenious solution to kind of to question it and to tackle it. He gave his brain a name. He calls his brain Becky. And he deliberately challenges Becky whenever she comes up with thoughts as if they're facts. So, for example, if Becky said to him, which is his inner voice speaking to him, I did really badly in that meeting, that person thinks I'm rubbish, this is never going to work. He'll actually, on the podcast which I listened to him talking about this, which I'll share with you after the meeting, he says he'll actually literally just stop himself in the street, not speak out loud, but have a word with his own brain in the street and just go, Becky, have you got any evidence for what you've just said? Because if you haven't got any evidence, I'm just not going to listen to you. Giving your brain a name I love this idea. I think it makes complete sense from a coaching perspective as well. It's a hack to interrupt your thinking and to challenge the thoughts that aren't helpful. Our brains are really good at scanning, as I mentioned in the first insight, our brains are really good at scanning the world for threats. We're on high alert for any problems or issues or tougher things. We're less good at focusing on the good things. So it's really good to have this hack available to you to use. So I'd like to kind of issue a challenge or a call to action. My son arguably has come up with a more creative name for his brain. He's a massive Star Wars fan, so he calls his brain Jabba. But if you think this would be useful to you, what name could you pick to apply to your brain? I give my brain the name Maggie, because it strikes me as a rather sensible name. And I think sometimes when I'm trying to push myself out of my comfort zone, Maggie pulls me back quite a lot and tells me, no, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. So Maggie gets a talking to every now and again. So just to summarize what we've talked about today, if your brain could talk, what are the 3 most important things it would tell you to help handle lockdown and help you manage your teams through lockdown? Recognizing that your brain is old-fashioned and that this ancient fight or flight reflex is really easily triggered by the situations that we're currently all living through. Recognizing that our brains get blocked easily, but thinking about how we can prioritize so that we take one challenge at a time, thinking about that sort of holding pattern of the planes in the sky and landing one at a time. And the final thing is about, don't forget to power me up. There are certain things that are obvious that we need, like food and water and exercise, but novelty is really important. It's like having a ready-made reward chemical that we can release into our bodies just as a result of the things we do or the things that we encourage our teams to do. So just before I come back to everyone, I just want to leave you all with my contact details in case you'd like to have a chat with me about the other stuff that I do. My email is sarah@sarahtaylorcoaching.co.uk. Let me just come out of this talk and come back. So we've got 10 minutes left. So what I tend to do when I'm in a group where everybody can talk is sort of go around the room, but I'm conscious that that doesn't really work here. So I'd love to encourage people to, well, A, ask any questions that you want to ask, and B, just, let me know what resonates with you and what you're going to take away from this talk that you might be able to apply both for yourself and for your teams. And if you're happy to come on and talk about it, that would be great. Just write us a note in the chat, and Joanna will turn your mic on.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Sarah. We've got a question from Jamie, who asked in terms of the Google X person, sorry, Mo. Is that similar to Steve Peters and coping with the chimp?
Oh, do you know what? The Chimp Paradox is next on my reading list, so I can't tell you because I don't know that book yet.
So we'll come back. We'll have to do another session and do it. and so what would be really great to understand as well is if any thoughts, or Beth has said she loves the thought of naming your brain, is to really understand ideas for novelty. So any people on the call, would be great if you put in the chat, because I think it helps other people to say, my goodness, my day is the same day in and out, especially for those of you on the call who are homeschooling at the moment, and the ability to find space for our brains, I think is, in our thinking time, and that, as you said, that reset. So if you could pop in the chat any thoughts or ideas that you have for novelty, I think that would be great. And as Sarah said, if you're happy to come onto mic, that would be fabulous as well. I'm trying to think of the novelty one. Is there any other kind of thoughts that people have? I like the night running.
Yes, I love that.
Oh.
I just have this vision of him just going around saying hello to people left, right and centre, because he thought that nobody else would be doing it, and actually it was just like the forest is, full of fellow walkers and joggers and dog walkers.
So I think Sian would like to make another question. I think you can speak, Sian, actually. Do you want to try? I think you're not on mute.
Okay, hi. Sorry, I feel like I'm taking over a little bit. No, the reason I wanted to it's really interesting, the whole novelty thing. So Joanna, because we had a conversation before Christmas about not making enough time for basically self-development, and in turn being able to develop my team further. So that's been something that last year for me was high stress, probably just a bit of a just in a bit of a whirl, really, that I think a lot of people were in as well, and just trying to keep head above water and all that stuff. And I think this year I've definitely made a conscious effort to join these types of things, to take myself out of that daily grind, and to open myself up to this type of development. So this is coming, I know it sounds a little bit cheesy, but it's genuine, and it's something that I can relate to in what you're saying.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. Thank you for sharing, Sian.
I've just seen Jemima's message. Yeah. Wow, Jemima.
I love that. So let's just read that out. I get up, Jemima, I get up at 5 a.m. and walk 8K every morning, whatever the weather, and practice gratitude for 10 minutes for my novelty. I think that's fantastic. I'm a fellow morning walker too, but I don't get up quite that early. It's more like 6:37. And Megan, thanks for a great talk. I've tried to do things away from the screen at the end of each day. Yeah, working from home, cooking, origami, colouring, knitting, reading, and the best one, just putting on a song and dancing. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Dancing to fuel the soul. And Ulrika, my novelty, which I've just started this year, is to read one BBC article in Welsh, looking for new vocabulary. Fantastic. Yeah, my son and daughter have actually started learning Welsh on Duolingo, so I'm constantly hearing Welsh in our household now too. Do the splits, amazing.
These are great.
Are you anywhere near?
If you're happy to share.
I just tried to do this myself, and
you're happy to
I
share.
a really bad injury to my muscles. I'm getting there, yes, but I had an operation which sent me back. Fantastic.
Perfect. Well, please keep them coming, actually, because I think they'll be good to share after the session as well, and to redo that. And I have to say, Sarah, what a fantastic way to kick off 2021 with our sessions and our content. That was absolutely fabulous. You have a great ability to make something that is so highly complex, so digestible and easy to understand, and have practical tips to walk away with, and so engaging. So thank you so much, Sarah. We hope to have you back again over 2021, and I hope you have enjoyed the session. The feedback that we are coming through is really positive. There will be a survey that will come out. It will come as you stop the browser, and it takes 10 seconds. So if you could just fill in that survey, that really helps us hone the sessions and make and continually improve them. And if you don't know WHTL, please do follow us on LinkedIn. All of our news goes through there, whereas, you know, contradicting what we say about social media, if you need a little hit of novelty, you can come onto our social media page and see what we've got happening. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much again, Sarah, and have a great rest of the week, everybody, and a great, you know, keep positive. 2021 is going to get, you know, after this, it's going to get better and better. So thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you,
enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you. Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye.